Hi, everyone. Today I have with me Dr. Carl Goldberg. He's in Glendale, Arizona. How are you today, Carl?
Just fine, Cari. Thank you so much for interviewing me today.
I'm happy to have you.
Great.
You have a PhD in European and Russian history, and after 9/11, something just begged you to study it. What was it?
Well, what was it? That's a good question. Everybody was shocked after 9/11, but most people simply remained shocked and didn't do anything about it. I remember that in those days, the newspapers were not quite as politically correct as they are now.
Yeah.
And so they were writing how all of these Muslim hijackers were reading the Quran all the time. And they were reciting verses from the Quran. So I figured if they could commit this kind of atrocity because of what they read in that book, I'd better know what's in that book too. So I went down to Borders bookstore and got myself the Penguin Classic English translation of the Quran. And I read it from cover to cover. And my hair stood on end. I couldn't imagine that people really believed this stuff. You have to read the Quran to know what's in it. It's far worse than you could ever imagine. And then so that's what motivated me. And then I started talking about it with other people. Nobody else has read the Quran that I could talk to. It just wasn't there. They didn't know anything about Islam. That many of them realized there's something wrong with Islam, but they had no idea what.
Yeah.
And so after reading the Quran, I read a whole bunch of other books on Islam and then began talking about it to other people. I figured our fellow citizens really need to know the truth about Islam.
Yeah.
Because it's an enormous threat, much greater threat than people are even willing to believe. But it's there, and the only way to know about that threat is to study it.
Yeah.
And most people don't want to spend the time, but without spending the time, there's no way to know it.
Right.
My purpose essentially now is to convey to people and save them time, because what I do, I examine the writings of the Islamic religious authorities, the most respected Islamic religious authorities, because that is the place to go to for the truth about Islam, in addition to the Quran and the sacred sayings of Muhammad. And I've got a book on Sharia law here. And so you go to the prime sources and go to the Islamic religious authorities because they spent their whole lives studying Islam and they know Islam better than anybody.
Yeah.
But they're not talking to non-Muslims. They're not propagandists. They're not spokesmen. They're talking to other Muslims, telling the Muslims how to behave according to Islam. So that's the only place to go to for the truth about Islam, and that's what I do. And so instead of even giving my own opinion about Islam, what I do is show you what the Islamic religious authorities say about Islam. That is the source of authority.
It sure
Not
is.
my authority. It's their authority, which I am simply conveying to our fellow citizens.
Excellent. Well, what a service you're providing. I remember, too, right after 9/11, we're all in shock. And our then president, George W. Bush, 8 days after it happened, came out in a press conference and he said, Islam is a religion of peace.
Yes, and that the Islamic murderers who committed this atrocity, they were perverting the religion. So here, President Bush was pretending to be an Islamic scholar. How in the world would he know what is a perversion of Islam if he doesn't know anything about Islam? But he's not the only one. Obama, of course, did this in spades afterwards.
Yeah.
But a lot of people insist that our enemy is really only Al Qaeda or ISIS, and that they are perverting Islam. But the people who say that don't know anything about Islam. There's the non-Muslims who say that. They have no way of judging what is a perversion and what is not a perversion. The only way to find out is to study Islam. Well, you read the Quran. That's the starting point for all study of Islam. You've got to know about the Quran. The Quran is the beginning point of everything in Islam, including the reverence, veneration of Muhammad. That comes from the Quran also, because the Quran tells everybody that Muhammad is the best example for everyone to follow. Well, what the Quran in Islamic eyes, they all believe, even if they've never read it, and many Muslims have never read it, they will all tell you that the Quran is the literal word of Allah, that is their God. The literal word, not the figurative word, not the metaphoric word, not the inspired word, but the literal word, which means that Muslims are required to read the Quran literally wherever it is possible to do so. There are parts of the Quran which cannot be read literally, but unfortunately, the parts that affect us the war against non-Muslims, yes, that can be read literally, and that is exactly what the Muslim terrorists do. They read it literally because that's what they're supposed to do, and they follow it.
Okay, so the parts that cannot be read literally, is that because of metaphor, or what's the reason?
Well, partly it's metaphoric. Or one, for example, there's a phrase in the Quran that speaks of the hand of God. Obviously, that is not to be read literally, because in the Muslim concept, God is not like Michelangelo portrayed God in the Sistine Chapel, with a head and hands and feet and so on. Not in Islam. There is no portrayal of God. In Islam, Allah is transcendent, has no form, no shape, and so it doesn't have a hand. But here the Quran speaks of the hand of God. Obviously, that is a figurative use of the word.
Okay.
That's clear. And there are other parts of the Quran, as I understand it, which even Muslim scholars cannot understand because it's just not clear. There's all kinds of stuff in the Quran, but those are not the parts of the Quran that concern us. The parts of the Quran that concern us are unfortunately very clear, where it says that non-Muslims, for example, are the worst of creatures, the vilest of animals, and so on. And it says that Muslims must make war on non-Muslims. It says that the Muslim community is the best community in the whole world. It says that Muslims are to be kind and merciful towards one another, but harsh and ruthless towards non-Muslims. That's pretty clear, and there's no other way to interpret that.
Right.
That's just the way it is, and that is the way Muslims are raised. Again, not all of them, because not all of them have read the Quran. In fact, perhaps most of them haven't. Let me relate one little story. A few years ago, I was in China, and the capital of China, Xi'an, has an ancient mosque. It looks very much like a Buddhist temple. But I was in the compound of the mosque there, and there were, in the courtyard, and there were 3 or 4 men from Australia standing next to me. One of them was a Muslim. But since they all spoke English. And the Muslim from Australia, he looked like he must have been from Pakistan or from India. He went into the mosque to pray. The rest of us were not allowed in there to pray. But when he came out, I thought, I'd take advantage of the opportunity and ask him a couple of questions. And so I started asking him about these questions, these passages in the Quran that call for war and hatred of non-Muslims. And he said, I never heard of them. And I said, how come? Haven't you ever read the Quran? He said, oh, yes, I've read the Quran, but I don't understand it. And this is true because he's from Pakistan, not from any of the Arabian countries. He does not speak Arabic, but he reads it in order to be able to pronounce it so that he can pronounce the words in the Quran, but he doesn't know what he's reading. 5/8 of the Muslim world are not Arabs, and so they don't speak Arabic and they don't understand it. All they do when they pick up the Quran, they can read the script to pronounce it, but they don't know what they're saying, and so they don't know necessarily what the Quran says. And so this nice guy, a nice Muslim from Australia, ultimately from Pakistan, I guess, he was kind of surprised that the Quran contained all of these things. He was not aware of it. I believe that he was not aware of it. I don't think he was pulling my leg. But this is true for a great many Muslims. They simply don't know what is in the Quran. They either are not religious at all and don't go to the mosque, or they, like this fellow, they go to the mosque and they pray, but they don't really know what they're praying for. Even the opening prayer that all Muslims who go to mosque will say 17 times a day. There's a passage in that opening prayer. It's only 7 lines long, but the Muslim beseeches Allah not to let them follow the path of those who have incurred the wrath of Allah, and not the path of those who have gone astray. Now, the prayer itself doesn't define who those people are, but if you look at the commentaries on the Quran by Muslim scholars, and if you read the rest of the Quran, you will see very clearly that what is meant here is that those who have incurred the wrath of Allah, the anger of Allah, and curse, those are the Jews. And I have a commentary on the Quran. It's one of the most popular Sunni commentaries on the Quran, and it says in parentheses there, the Jews, when it refers to those who have incurred the anger of God, and then the ones who have gone astray are the Christians. And so this prayer, said 17 times a day, is in fact a prayer against Jews and Christians. Many Muslims may not even realize that, but the religious ones do, and certainly the religious community knows very well what this is, because they've read the Quran and they've read the commentaries, so they know all about this. And so this is the kind of thing we're faced with in the community. The Muslim community is divided. And you can divide it in many different ways, but the way is useful for us is to divide it into Muslims who follow the jihadist commands in the Quran and those Muslims who don't follow the jihadist commands in the Quran. The thing is that the commands are there whether anybody follows them or not. And because those commands and the Quran is taught and preached in every mosque in the world, it will always lead to new groups of Muslims who take it seriously.
Yeah.
And so it will be a constant source of Islamic supremacism and imperialism.
All right. So you have a history degree in European history.
Yes.
This sounds to me almost like a parallel in Christendom, where the Bible was in Latin. A lot of people were illiterate at the time, and the religious scholars would tell the people what it meant.
Yes, in fact, the Catholic Church prohibited the people from reading the Bible. It was only for the priest class to do that, and the scholars. But it was not taken off the proscription list, I think, until about 1952, when the Catholics were then permitted to read the Bible themselves.
Oh, my goodness.
And this, of course, caused quite a stir. That was what the Protestant Reformation was all about, was to put the Bible in the hands of the believers. And there were people who were executed because they printed up the Bible in the language of the people and gave it to the people. I forgot the name of the person, but there's more than one who was actually put to death because of they put the Bible into the hands of the believers. But that's what the Protestant Reformation was all about. Let me just say a word about Reformation. You will find a lot of people who are really ignorant about the Reformation saying that, well, Islam needs to undergo a Reformation like the Christians did, Christian Reformation. Well, there was no Christian Reformation. There was not a reform of Christianity. It was a Protestant Reformation, which was a revolt against the power of the Catholic Church. And it put these scriptures into the hands of the believers. Well, that is exactly the problem in Islam. When you put the Islamic scriptures, that is the Quran, into the hands of the believers, you get jihadists, because that's what's in the Islamic scriptures. When Christians actually follow their scriptures, they become pacifists. So that's something that most people don't realize. Even these some of these moderate Muslims keep talking about, well, Islam has to undergo a reformation like Christianity did, but they don't understand the Christian Reformation because there wasn't any. It was a Protestant Reformation, and they don't understand the Islamic Reformation. In fact, and a similar Reformation did take place, and those are the Wahhabis, the ones who in fact went back to the scripture of the Quran and put that into the hands of the people and wanted the Muslims to begin following what was in the Quran, because for hundreds of years they were paying only lip service to it without actually following it. And so if there's a reformation at all in Islam, it's taken place and it's led precisely to jihadism, because it goes back to their scriptures which command jihad.
Right. So the jihadists then would be similar to Christian fundamentalists who take the text literally and who are claiming to follow it the most closely.
Yes, exactly. In Islam, the fundamentalists become jihadists because part of the fundamentals of Islam, that is the scriptures, tell them to be jihadists. Their God commands them to be. In Christianity, their God commands them to love thy neighbor. It's very different. So Christian fundamentalists will, in fact, become pretty close to pacifists necessarily. Well, not quite, because there's still defensive wars. But otherwise, they tend to be towards pacifism, because that's what Christianity in the Gospels preaches. Jesus was not a warlord like Muhammad. Jesus preached peace, whereas Muhammad was a warlord and he preached war and he conducted war. So it's a very different notion of what religion is all about. And that's what I say. In Islam, then, the Reformation was to go back to the Quran as the basis of guiding your life. As fundamentalist Christians will go back to the Gospels as the basis for guiding their life. You know, you can also say that if Islam were a religion of peace, its fundamentalists and its extremist practitioners would be peaceful. But they're not. They're not. Because they go back to the fundamentals, and their fundamentals tell them to be jihadists. And that's a point that people often don't realize. But say if Islam were a religion of peace, then its extremist practitioners would be extremely peaceful, right?
Right. And that's not what we're seeing, is it? Okay,
No.
so in America, you're in Phoenix.
Yes.
Tell me what's happening in your neck of the woods, and where do you see this kind of clash of cultures? We've just had an election in France. Europe's having some clash of civilizations, and then where do you see America heading? What do you see on the horizon for us?
Well, at the moment, America is heading to the same place that Europe has already gone, but we're a number of years behind. Because here the Muslim population in our country is presumably about 1%, maybe a little more than 1%. In Europe, in many places, it's 5 or 6 or 7%. In France, it's probably close to 10%. And they tend to concentrate in Europe in major cities so that they're not spread around evenly in the population, which means they have much more political power because of that population concentration. And they swing the elections. The previous election in France, when Hollande was elected, he was elected because of the French Muslim vote. If the French Muslims had not voted, he would have lost. And so the Muslims put him in power. This time, what's his name? Macron is now the president of France because of the Muslims. They all voted for him. But in addition, there were lots of other people who simply did not want Le Pen to be
And it's
president.
important to note, too, that France doesn't have something similar to our electoral college that keeps strong urban areas from controlling the rest of the country.
Exactly
And
right.
so when they congregate in urban areas like that, it's specifically to swing elections and to have political power.
Yes, and all the mosques were pushing for Macron to be elected, and so that there was no division really in the Muslim community. They know what they want, and they vote as a bloc.
What do
to
they
get
want?
it.
What do they want?
Well, what do they want? They want eventually to establish France as a Muslim country. All Muslims want to establish the whole world as a Muslim empire, country by country. And they don't have a short-term time frame like we're used to. I mean, they've been at this world conquest business for 1,400 years. And if it takes them another 200 or 300 years, that's all right with them. They'll do it. There was a statement by Libyan dictator Gaddafi a few years ago, which said that that Muslims are going to conquer Europe without firing a shot, without swords and without guns. That is through immigration. Because Muslims immigrate in mass. By the way, that is an Islamic doctrine. You immigrate in order to spread the word of Islam. You form Islamic communities which don't assimilate, and they will increase in size because of immigration and because of reproduction. The reproduction rate is much higher, and so eventually their proportion of the population will grow and grow, and they will have increasing influence on the life of the country, on elections, on the cultural life of the country. They will begin demanding and receiving that school cafeterias, for example, will not serve any pork, but they'll serve halal meat. So in other words, you're depriving the host population of their opportunity to eat pork, at least in the schools. And they will put pressure on restaurants where they can and hotels. And in schools, they will demand the right for Muslim women to wear a hijab, show their religion. And they will demand the right for Muslim girls not to partake in physical education, or certainly not co-ed physical education. In other words, you go against the secular principles of the country. If you have enough power, you'll get it, because the host population is afraid to make trouble. They don't want trouble. They think that if you're really nice to these Muslims and give them what they want, that they'll be nice back. Well, that's they don't know Islam, because Islam says quite the opposite. Islam says to make war on the non-Muslims and conquer them, and to establish Islamic law as of the land. That is what we're aiming for. We have a number of statements even from Muslims in this country saying that is what they eventually want, is that for America to become an Islamic country.
Yep.
And one of the first steps in that is to abolish freedom of speech, which means you abolish the right to criticize Islam. The entire Muslim world has pushed the United Nations to do this, and they've passed a number of resolutions from the General Assembly,
Mm-hmm.
wanting to criminalize what they call defamation of religion, but mainly is defamation of Islam. In other words, criminalize any kind of criticism of Islam. In
Right.
Europe, they don't have a First Amendment right like we do. And so in Europe, they have already passed laws limiting what you can say. And
Well,
one of the things you're not allowed to say is criticism of Islam
yeah.
because that
And
insults
hasn't Canada?
Muslims.
Canada has joined that chorus, have they
Yes,
not?
Canada, correct. Canada does not have our First Amendment right either. And yes, they are prohibiting criticism of Islam where they can do that. It is happening in the
Okay,
United
so
States.
I'm hearing a real clash of cultures in that the European Canadian model is to welcome these people and to help them want to assimilate into their countries. Come be a part of our melting pot or our mosaic or whatever kumbaya term they want. Come and assimilate and become a part of our country. And you're saying that Islam absolutely teaches against that. They're not there to assimilate, they're there to dominate.
Yes, they are. And in fact,
Okay.
the Quran specifically prohibits them from assimilating.
Okay, so they're prohibited.
Absolute
So
prohibition.
right.
But you mentioned Canada and Europe
Yeah.
that they want to integrate. Actually, what's going on with this multicultural diversity stuff, which has become practically law of the land in those places, is not to assimilate them, but to allow them to remain unassimilated. That's the danger.
Yeah.
There's no program to assimilate them. Where they're, for example, required to learn English, required to learn what Canadian and European values of the Enlightenment are. No, there's no programs requiring
And that's
that.
where we're getting these no-go zones. Is that kind of how that works?
The no-go zones are where the Muslim population is so concentrated. The vast majority are Muslims, and they sometimes do not permit the authorities to enter the neighborhood, like even the police and the ambulance and the fire trucks. They were stoned or shot or whatever, and then God forbid that a non-Muslim should stroll down the streets there. That's what it is, no go. And the policemen, they don't go there either because they don't want to take their lives in their hands, and the government doesn't force it. In other words, the government is not enforcing its own laws. It's allowing the formation of these separate Muslim communities, which will govern themselves according to Sharia law as much as possible. Obviously, they can't do everything, but they can do a lot.
Right.
And that is what they're doing. In England, they even have recognized about 85 Islamic Sharia courts as a substitute for English courts when it comes to family law. Well, that's a danger because it's a danger to women.
Yeah.
Because Islamic family law is not like our family law. There is no such thing as gender equality in Islam. It is absolutely forbidden because their God forbids it. Their God specifically says that men are created superior to women and women must obey the men. There's no question about that. And the Quran also has other specifications which relegate women to a position of legal as well as moral inferiority. And part of that means they must also be sexually available to the men whenever the men want and whenever the women are physically capable of it. That's part of Sharia law. All of this stuff is anchored in Sharia law.
Right.
So there's no such thing, for example, as marital rape in Islam because the husband has rights, sexual rights over his wife. And so he can't rape her because rape implies a legitimacy of resistance. In Islam, they don't have a legitimate right to resist.
Right. So we've got a real clash. We've got no assimilating. We've got this view of hospitality as almost a green light to conquer, seen in the eyes of Islam. We've got the Islam community actually taking advantage of the laws of the host country, or even the political culture, the political correctness, and using that to advance themselves at our expense, at the host country's expense, such as, we must be sensitive to them. We must not, we need to forego our free speech laws so that we don't offend them and their religion.
Yes.
What is the problem then for Europe, for America, for Canada, for these countries? What is the problem with them seeing Islam as simply just a religion?
Well, yes, part of the fact is that they are simply ignorant. Like people in America too, they don't know what Islam is all about, and say they sort of assume that, well, Islam's a religion, so it must be pretty similar to our religions. Well, that's obviously a huge mistake. Uh, that's the first thing. But then this leftist notion that must never criticize Islam, that's simply part of leftist ideology these days. There's, in fact, David Horowitz wrote a very good book called The Unholy Alliance, which is about the alliance between the leftists and the Muslim community. So the leftists and Islam, you would think that they wouldn't be able to ally on anything because what they want is so totally opposite to one another. For example, the leftists insist on gender equality. Islam prohibits gender equality. The leftists insist on total equality and respect for homosexuals. Islam says kill them. The leftists insist on total separation of religion and state and the suppression of religion. Islam says that there is no such thing as separation of religion and state. Yeah. All of life is religious, which is what makes Islam so very different from all the religions. And so you would think that they would have nothing in common. But what they do have in common, that they both want to destroy the Enlightenment of Europe and the United States and all of our values based on the Enlightenment, based on equality before the law, based on gender equality, based on freedom of speech and freedom of religion. All of those things are prohibited by Islam. And so that's what they want to destroy.
Okay, so they want to destroy it because that's going to get in the way of their goal of a one-world caliphate.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. America is really the last bastion of freedom, and it's not clear how long we're going to be able to hold up with this. But yes, there's a book by Mark Steyn called America Alone, I believe. Very good.
Mark
book.
Steyn, yes. Yeah.
Yes. Very good, and I think it's several years old, but he's absolutely correct. The trend is to give up our rights in order not to have problems. And we are seeing this big war against freedom of speech in the United States now. The leftists are actively campaigning against freedom of speech in the universities, for example, and even outside the universities. I've run into this all the time on discussions on the internet, for example. There's someone just the other day, one of these leftists who just can't stand criticizing Islam in any way, saying that this Act for America rally last Saturday was unlawful. Unlawful? The First Amendment to the Constitution, in addition to freedom of speech, says the government shall make no laws prohibiting the free assembly, peaceable assembly of people.
Yes.
So she doesn't care about the Constitution. And there are a number of them in that same discussion who said that this kind of speech, hate speech, should be unlawful. It should be prohibited. And so this is what we see in this country now, is a movement to make hate speech criminalized. And this is exactly what the Muslims have been pushing for years. 3 years ago, 3.5, there was a poll taken of American Muslims, and 58% of American Muslims said that the Constitution's First Amendment of freedom of speech should not protect criticism of Islam. That's a majority of American Muslims. 45%, almost half of them, said that criticism of Islam should be criminalized. So they're all against the Constitution. And of course, let's say the first thing to go is the freedom of speech, because if we are not permitted to talk about it, we're finished. Can't do anything anymore.
Right.
We can't speak.
Right.
So freedom of speech is the most important freedom that we have. All of the other freedoms depend on our freedom of speech.
Right.
And so there's a war in this country on right now. The leftists and the Muslims together are trying to criminalize hate speech. There's nothing in the First Amendment that says freedom of speech except for hate speech. All right? Hate speech, however you define it, and that's, of course, a very subjective term. What they call hate speech about Islam is, in fact, what Muslim religious authorities say is the truth about Islam. And they say it's a good thing, making war on non-Muslims, suppressing women, and so on, because that's what Allah wants. And so it's a good thing. It's not considered hate speech in Islamic religious circles. It's religious speech. So we are in a very serious situation where the country's divided. And we saw that last election. And half the country does not want freedom of speech. They want to criminalize speech that they don't like. And we see this all over the universities. Not just the students are clamoring for it, but the university itself will pass regulations prohibiting the students from saying certain things. There's no more freedom of speech at the universities.
Yeah.
So we have to be very, very careful about that. If the trend continues, we're going to lose. It'll take another 20 or 30, 40 years, but once we lose our freedom of speech, the rest is going to be easy for them.
Okay. Well, that's definitely a hill worth dying on for sure, is that freedom of speech and standing up for it.
Oh, Cari, that's the most important right and freedom that we have is freedom of speech. And that's why we need to press it everywhere. And there are always bureaucrats, administrators who want to suppress freedom of speech, either because they really believe that nobody should criticize Islam or because they're afraid of controversy. There is that too. Yeah. I have, for example, been prohibited from teaching in certain adult education programs in certain communities because it's just too controversial. And the administrators of the programs, they don't want controversy. No bureaucrat controversy. They just want to keep things running smoothly. And so all it takes is one or two people to stir up controversy. A couple of loudmouths. You know, the wheel that squeaks the loudest gets the grease. And one case in a suburb of Phoenix, in a retirement community, where I had taught 160 students. And 2 or 3 of them complained to the administration that I was spreading hatred and that should not be permitted. And so they canceled my future courses in that program and haven't had me back for that. It's just too controversial. I talked to them, had long discussions with them, and they were very clear that it was the controversial nature that was the problem. They just don't want to offend anybody. And so what they will do, they will permit all kinds of Muslim propaganda to be taught in those courses by representatives of the Muslim community, the Muslim Speakers Bureau, for example, whose stated purpose is to improve the image of Islam and to combat negative stereotypes. You know, that's what Obama said. Remember, in his speech in 2009, he went to speak to the Muslim world in Cairo. A lot of absolutely disgraceful things in that speech, but one of the most disgraceful was that he said, quote, "I consider it my responsibility as President of the United States to fight against negative stereotypes of Islam wherever they may appear," unquote. Well, the Constitution doesn't describe the job duties of the president in that way at all. There's nothing in there about defending the negative, fighting the negative stereotypes of anything, let alone Islam. And yet here's a president of the United States going to the Muslim world and saying this. And by the way, the concept of the Muslim world is kind of weird. We don't have any concept of a Christian world or a Jewish world or a Hindu world or a Buddhist world, but there's a Muslim world. And people sort of take that as legitimate. Well, it's legitimate only because it comes from the Quran. The Quran divides the world into the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world. That's it. That's where this comes from. We have no business recognizing the legitimacy of that division of the world. And yet that is what we are doing. That is what and Trump almost did that when he went to speak in Saudi Arabia, but not quite. He divided the Muslim world, which is essentially a good thing for us. But Obama was all in favor of the Muslim world, and he was supporting it.
Yeah. And basically what he was saying is Islam doesn't need to reform, it just needs better PR.
It can be what?
It just needs better PR.
Yes. He made himself into a PR agent for Islam, saying that he's going to fight against negative stereotypes of Islam. Well, that's what a PR person does, to fight against negative stereotypes and improve the image. That's what a PR does. And that's what Obama made himself into, as a PR man for Islam. But not only PR, of course, he actually gave specific help and aid and assistance to our enemies, without question.
All right.
And he's not alone. There are Republicans who are doing this too, unfortunately. McCain is on the side of the Muslim Brotherhood. Jeff Flake is on the side of the Muslim Brotherhood. And
they're in Arizona. Tell me about that. How did Arizona elect these two guys and keep electing these two guys? What is up with that?
Well, most people are not interested in the subject. They're not concerned about Islam. They don't know about Islam. And so they run on other issues. And on those other issues, Flake and McCain seem to be better than the Democrat opponent. And so they voted for McCain and for Flake. Flake is coming up for re-election next year.
He's got a good opponent, too.
We don't want him. He's terrible when it comes to the Islam issue.
Yeah.
But on other issues, he's probably better than the Democrat. And so
Right.
we're in a dilemma here.
Well,
What do you
Flake's
do?
got a good primary opponent. Dr. Kelly Ward is going to run against Jeff Flake in 2018.
Yes, she is. I had my run-in with Dr. Kelly Ward during the primaries last time.
Mm-hmm.
She refuses to take a stand against the Muslim Brotherhood. And I cornered her on a number of occasions, and in person and on the internet. And finally on Facebook, I was able to corner her and say, what is your stand? Give us your stand on the Muslim Brotherhood. Finally, after all of this, she said, I'm against it. Well, what kind of an answer is that? Ask an evangelical Christian about sin, and if he answers, I'm against it, what kind of an answer is that? It doesn't mean anything. So she's not against the Muslim Brotherhood. She refuses to take a stand against, take a stand in favor of the Muslim Brotherhood Terrorist Designation Act, which is a bill before both houses of Congress.
Okay.
And she refuses to take a stand on that. That's the most important piece of legislation before Congress at this time.
Right.
It's ultimately more important than the health care issue, more important than the trade issues and everything else, because if we don't take a stand against the Muslim Brotherhood and all of their infiltration of American institutions, we're going to lose. And all of these other programs will be secondary, because if we lose our country to the Muslims, and which is what the Muslim Brotherhood wants, and they say so, they have a program for the United States, by the way, which I'd like to read to everybody. Let me read it to you now.
Okay.
Very quickly. Their program for the Muslim Brotherhood is this. It says, the process of settlement, that is Muslim immigration, is a civilization jihadist process with all that the word means. The Muslim Brotherhood must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands. Now they're talking about non-Muslims, by the non-Muslim hands and the hands of the believers, so that Western civilization is eliminated and Allah's religion is made victorious over all other religions. That is their program for the United States, and they are well on the way to doing it. And this is called the stealth jihad, sabotaging our country from within. You infiltrate our institutions, not just government institutions, they've done that, but our educational institutions from kindergarten through universities, the mass media, the legal system. All over, you have Muslims pushing the Islamic agenda and not the American agenda. And this is what the stealth jihad is all about. We should really devote a lot more time to that. Robert Spencer wrote a good book several years ago entitled The Stealth Jihad.
The stealth jihad, okay.
And this is more important than the hot jihad, the violent jihad. What I told people at the rally last Saturday, there are 3 existential threats that we are facing from Islam, and ISIS is not one of them. ISIS kills people. They invent all kinds of ingenious ways to torture people to death, and it attracts the headlines. It's sensational. So everybody's looking at ISIS. But that takes our attention away from the real Islamic threats. And there are 3. The first one is the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, nobody refers to Iran as the Islamic Republic of Iran, but that is its official name. The Islamic Republic. And if you want to understand why Iran behaves the way it does, you have to understand that it is an Islamic Republic and not just another country. And they say in their own constitution, they tell us point blank that they're going to use their military forces to spread the word of Allah to other countries. In other words, they're going to commit military aggression in order to spread Islam. They tell us that right in their constitution. And they're developing the intercontinental missiles, and they are working on nuclear weapons. They have other weapons of mass destruction. If they explode an electromagnetic pulse bomb above the United States, that could knock out all of our electronics for most of this country for months. That would mean millions of people would die because there'd be no more fresh water, there'd be no food production and distribution, no more medical services, because all of that depends on electronics. And if you knock the electronics out, it paralyzes society, and people would die within a few months, millions of them. So that's the first existential threat from Islam. The second existential threat from Islam is mass Muslim immigration, because that changes the population permanently. It establishes Muslim communities all through the United States, which, like cancerous tumors, will grow and not assimilate into the rest of the body. They will grow separately and begin to press on the rest of the body. And that will increase their proportion of population through immigration and through high reproduction rate. Muslim men are permitted to have up to 4 wives, and some of them do. A number of them do. We don't know how many, and it happens in this country. They come to this country with 1 wife, and then they go back to their home country and bring back another wife, put the first one on welfare, and then he's with the second one. He goes back and does it a third and a fourth time. And they can divorce these wives after they've had children with them, put them on welfare, and then get new wives and do this again. So it's not unusual for a Muslim polygamist to have 15 or 20 or 30 children. You know, bin Laden was one of 56 children that his father had with a number of different wives. They're huge numbers. And of course, those children will have lots of children. And so their rate of population increase is far greater than that of the host country. So that plus the immigration is what we call the demographic jihad. That is a serious, irreparable threat to our country, because once you change the population, you can't do anything about it. The third existential threat to our country is what we just talked about, the Muslim Brotherhood's stealth jihad. This is what they call the civilization jihad, using the hands of the non-Muslims. In other words, non-Muslims will bring these people into power. The moderate or the liberal Christian pastors and priests, the liberal Jewish rabbis, they are on the side of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're all preaching that Islam is a religion of peace, and they tell their congregations that. Well, the whole notion of the interfaith sessions, this is part of the Muslim Brotherhood's official program. And all of these liberal Christians and Jews are falling for it. Instead of opposing Islam, they're claiming that Islam, like President Bush says, is a religion of peace. They're telling their congregations that. And of course, the congregations want to hear that. They don't want to be disturbed by the thought that, my God, we're in a civilization war here. This is a major crisis to our civilization. Nobody wants to hear that. They'd much rather hear that, oh, these Muslims are all so nice and peaceful people. And so there's no problem. And so that is all under the radar because nobody's paying attention to it. So my job is to help people pay attention to it.
All right. So if somebody's listening to this and they're kind of panicked and they want to know, what can I do? What can I do to help or halt or whatever? What can be done?
Anything.
What can be done?
Right. Practically speaking, the first and most important thing is to urge your congressmen and senators to support the Muslim Brotherhood Terrorist Designation Act.
Okay.
It's got to be done.
Number one.
It is the most important piece of legislation because they must be stopped, that infiltration of our system. And then, of course, Muslim immigration must be stopped. That's the second thing. In other words, that has to be supported. President Trump can't do it by himself, although legally he can, but he's being resisted on all sides. He's got to be supported in this. And the reason is simple. These Muslims bring with them, to varying degrees, not just the threat of terrorism, that is there also, but they bring with them all of the ideological baggage of Islamic superiority, because that's the way they were raised. They believe that the Quran is the literal word of their God, and the Quran tells them to make war on non-Muslims, to suppress women, to suppress Jews, and to kill homosexuals, and so on. The whole range of these things. Their values are not American values. And one of them, as we've mentioned before, is the prohibition of criticizing Islam. In other words, they want to abolish our First Amendment freedom of speech. So this is generally true of Muslim immigrants. There may be a few who don't support this, but we don't know unless we actually find out. They've got to be vetted. And we must permit into our country only people whom we think share our values. And Islamic values are antagonistic to American values, and we must never think that they're compatible. They're not compatible. The question: there are some Muslims who don't accept Islamic values, who do accept American values, but they do it quietly because they can't stand up and say that they disagree with anything in the Quran or anything that Muhammad said. Even these so-called moderate Muslims will not ever criticize the Quran or Muhammad, even though they don't like it. They
Is,
don't
is
like
that
the
out of
value.
fear of their own safety? What is the reason?
Well, partly in this country, I don't know that they have to be in terrible great fear of their safety, but it's part, they would certainly fear being ostracized by
Okay.
their family, their friends, their relatives,
Mm-hmm.
and if they do business in the Muslim community, they will lose the business.
Yeah.
In other words, because Islam considers that any Muslim who criticizes anything in the Quran becomes an apostate. And according to Sharia law, the penalty for apostasy is death.
Mm.
But certainly they're not allowed to carry out the death penalty here. They do carry it out in Saudi Arabia, in
Yeah.
Iran, and Sudan, and elsewhere. But they can't do that here because this is not a Muslim country yet.
Yeah.
So what they fear is ostracism. They also fear for their reputations
Mm-hmm.
because they've made their reputation being a moderate Muslim. For example, there are a couple of them. I won't mention any names at this point on this show, maybe next time,
Right.
who are celebrity moderate Muslims, and all they're doing is hoodwinking the non-Muslim population into thinking that Islam can be reformed and that these moderate Muslims are the ones to do it. But these moderate Muslims will never, ever stand up and say anything against the Quran and Muhammad. And of course, that's the problem with Islam. There's no way to cure Islam without jettisoning most of the Quran and most of what Muhammad said.
Yeah.
And nobody can do that. Muslims can't do that. They will be considered apostates. So Islam cannot be reformed. And there are some people going around saying, well, we have to work for Islamic reform. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Because the fundamental proposition of Islam is that the Quran is their God's literal word. And as such, it is perfect, it is complete,
Yeah.
it is unchangeable, and it is valid for all of eternity. No human being is going to dare contest the literal word of their God. Look, even in Christianity and Judaism, people don't follow the Ten Commandments, but they'll never criticize them.
Mm.
You know, you can't stand up and say, well, we really ought to change the Ten Commandments because we don't like them. You can't do that because that's the literal word of the God.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't. Well, in Islam, the entire Quran is the literal word of their God.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can't criticize anything in the Quran. And so whatever is in the Quran, we and Muslims are stuck with forever. And that's the problem. So there's no possible reform of Islam. What you can do is suppress it, but you can't reform it.
Okay. So, and so how would one go about helping to suppress it?
Well, first of all, pass this Muslim Brotherhood Terrorist Designation Act. Second, the prohibit Muslim immigration, so at least you staunch the flow of this.
Right.
It's bad enough as it is, but it's going to get worse if you bring more of these people in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Third, you have to begin focusing on the mosques because they're preaching this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You have to go into the schools, which are at the moment, they all teach about Islam in the schools, and the chapters in the books that they use are written by the Muslim propagandists because the textbook editors and compilers don't know anything about Islam, and so they figure, well, if we don't know something about Islam, let's go ask a Muslim. Well, that's the worst thing you can do, is ask a Muslim about Islam. You would not ask an employee of Philip Morris for the truth about tobacco smoking, and you don't ask a Muslim. Really, in the same reason. You don't ask a Muslim for the truth about Islam because they all work for their organization. They will tell you only what their organization wants you to know. If you want to find the truth about Islam, you go to the Islamic sources, which are not meant as propaganda for non-Muslims. They're meant to show Muslims what Islam is all about.
Right.
So that's where you go. So stop these interfaith things. We, as Action, we need to go to these interfaith sessions and raise questions and to show the audience that they're not learning about Islam from the panelists, because the Christians won't talk about it, the rabbis won't talk about it, and the Muslims certainly will not talk about it. And so we have to go there and stir things up a little bit, ask them these questions. So
And
there
it's
are
the
a number
mosques that are having the interfaith meetings, aren't they?
Well, they work together with churches and synagogues. So it's not just they open the mosque to this. They do this interfaith work through the churches and the synagogues. And in other words, they have the rabbis and the priests and the pastors do this propagandistic work for them. They've made them into tools for spreading Islam and spreading false notions about Islam, that Islam is a religion of peace. And when people believe that, they will never be able to take any action against Islam like the actions that we've talked about.
Right.
For example, why in the world would you ever want to prevent Muslim immigrants from coming to this country if you believe that Islam's a religion of peace.
Right.
Right? And that's what happens. And why would you even want to take action against the Muslim Brotherhood if you believe that Islam is a religion of peace? Because they represent Islam. So we need to educate people, and they need to begin taking action. Go to the PTA meetings in school, talk to the teachers and the principals of those schools that are teaching Islam to the kids. There's a big scandal in the San Diego School District recently where they're instituting a program together with the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is a terrorist-linked Muslim Brotherhood organization.
Yes.
And the school district works with them to institute these programs in the schools to improve the image of Islam in the eyes of the school students. So this is what's going on.
Yeah.
The schools are indoctrinating our students in favor of Islam. That must stop. And so anybody who has children or grandchildren in the schools needs to go to the school administrators and start talking about this and show what Islam is all about by citing the Quran and citing Muhammad. Cite Islamic sources all the time. Anybody can do that. It's all in translation.
Right.
All you have is do it. And by the way, if anybody would like, I can send them materials on this which they can use in their discussions about Islam.
Okay.
Send me an email at ideologyofislam@cox.net. That's ideologyofislam@cox.net. I'll be happy to send you all the materials.
Excellent. Well, I would like to also get the books you've recommended and any action items. I'll put them in the description below the video so that people who want to take action can know where and how to do that.
Absolutely. Put my name and my email address there so that people can write to me. I'll be happy to send them these materials. I use these materials in my lectures and in my courses. They are excerpts from the Islamic sources, unadulterated.
Right.
And that's the way to do it.
And that's the way to do it.
It's all of the Muslim terrorists quote the Quran and Muhammad. All of them. And so we need to know what's in there.
We need to know what's in there.
9/11 people that led me to study Islam, they quoted the Quran, and that's why I went out and read the Quran. Everybody should do that. If I were dictator, I would have every high school student read the Quran as a requirement for graduation from high school.
Yeah.
They must know what's in that book.
Right. Well, thank you for what you're doing, for, like you said, being a source for people who are maybe going about their lives, not paying attention, maybe don't have the time or the wherewithal to research the way you have, and for giving this information to us so that we can digest it and then take action on it. So
yes, I gave them time because I've gone through these Islamic materials and I've prepared them so that people can read them without spending hundreds or thousands of hours like I have, and then picking out the nuggets. I give them the nuggets right away.
Excellent. So, well, we appreciate this work. It's very, very important what you're doing, and thank you so very much for talking to us about it today and for your time today. I just appreciate it so much.
Thank you for your work in helping to spread the truth about Islam.
Happy to help
in
any way I can.
Thank you.